Welcome to Author Life Podcast, where myself and guest authors share their stories, offer tips and advice, and share our writing, publishing, and marketing knowledge. I'm your host, Delcherie Gladden. Welcome back to Author Life Podcast. This week we're going to be talking about storytelling, and we're going to start that topic off by talking about narrative modes and mainly point of view. So telling the right story means telling it from the best point of view and by using the best narrative modes for that story. And narrative modes might be a term that you're not familiar with, so we're going to kind of define that and talk about it first. Narrative mode and narration are really easy to confuse, but they are different things. Narration is the use of commentary to convey a story to the reader, while narrative modes in fiction are the methods that are used to actually tell the story. The most common methods used in fiction are narrative point of view, narrative tense, and narrative voice. So we're going to delve into each mode, and we're going to begin with the one that writers and readers are usually most familiar with, and that's point of view. So narrative point of view links the narrator to the story. It reveals who is telling the story and what their relationship is to the story events and the characters. The narrator is often a character, but it can also be an unknown observer who conveys thoughts or opinions, or a completely unknown observer who only relates the events without any additional commentary. Writing from the point of view of a character is very common in modern popular fiction. It's probably what most readers are used to seeing. But telling a story from an observer's perspective is still used. Most often you'll see that in literary fiction. It is not often that a reader comes across a contemporary book written from the perspective of an observer who offers no commentary, but some writers may still use that. Now, when we're talking about point of view, what we're really discussing is how and by whom the story is told. Narrative point of view is the perspective through which a story is communicated to the reader, and it can greatly affect how a story is told and how the reader connects with the story and its various players. Now, of course, there are multiple point of views through which to tell a story, including first person, where the protagonist or observer is the narrator, second person, where the reader is the character and is addressed directly, and third person, which can go between omniscient, objective, limited, and deep versions. Each type is going to have a different impact on the story, including how close a reader can get to the characters, what limitations a particular point of view places on storytelling, and what the reader can know through the character. Narrative point of view is the perspective through which a story is communicated. So if you want to tell the story from a direct perspective of the main character or an observer, first person is most often going to be the point of view that you'll want to use. So let's dig a little bit deeper into first person point of view. Now, there are two variations of first person point of view. First person protagonist is when the character narrates his or her own story. This is very common in popular fiction right now. It allows the reader a close personal look into the character's experiences, thoughts, and emotions. The other variation is first person observer, and this is when a secondary character tells the main character's story. A good example of that is Dr. Watson narrating the Sherlock Holmes cases. This is less common in modern fiction, but it is still used by some writers and can be used effectively. It's a useful style when you don't want the reader to be directly inside the main character's mind, and when the story is better served being told by someone who can somewhat objectively tell the main character's story. So, advantages of first person. This point of view often feels very natural to the reader because it's typically how we speak about our world and experiences to other people in real life. Dealing with only one character's mind is also often a lot easier for the writer than trying to write from multiple narrative perspectives. It's also usually easier for the reader to follow the story and keep track of events. Another benefit is that it creates a unique and distinctive internal voice. Being in only one character's mind at a time makes it easier to stay in character as well. So this is really popular for new or young writers for that reason. It tends to be a little easier to write in general. Readers also get to experience the story vicariously more easily in first person, which may or may not be a benefit to the story and should be a factor in considering what point of view you want to use. There's also opportunity to create an unreliable narrator with first person. However, this is a very challenging point of view to write from and must be very well planned out from beginning to end to be really successful. First person is also more intimate and can fully immerse a reader in a story, which might be too much for some stories that have triggers or are highly intense or emotional. So, of course, there are also some disadvantages to first person point of view. Writers are limited to writing only about what the character narrator can see, know, and hear. This makes it difficult to hide things from the main character or to reveal information to the reader without the main character knowing that same information as well. The narrator must be in every scene, observing and participating in the story. This limits what scenes the reader can observe and what information the reader is privy to. And lastly, minds of other characters are off limits with first person, as is their knowledge about the story, unless directly shared with the narrator in some way, which most often comes through dialogue. Now, third person point of view has 4 variations, and we'll go through each one briefly one at a time. So third person omniscient has an all-knowing narrator who tells the story. The narrator can share the thoughts and feelings of all characters at any point in a scene and knows information that the characters do not. Third person objective has a narrator who can only tell the reader things which could be recorded by a camera or microphone. The narrator can't share any thoughts or feelings of the characters and can't reveal information to the reader that is not communicated, discovered, or shown directly by a character. And then third person limited has a narrator who tells the story from the perspective of a single character. The perspective of the narrator can switch to various characters in different scenes, but the narrator is limited to sharing what the characters see, hear, and experience. Third person deep tells the story in the hero's voice rather than the author's voice. The narrator can share internal thoughts and feelings of the character, but is limited to only that one character's experiences. Now, the advantages of third-person omniscient are that the story can be written as an onlooker watching the full story unfold. You can add contrasting viewpoints with other characters, but you cannot head hop or bounce between characters' thoughts and experiences within the same scene. This can give a reprieve to the reader and allow them to see another side of the story. You can also expand the scope of the story by moving between settings and viewpoints. And you aren't limited to characters in the story when choosing a narrator, which can provide a unique perspective. And lastly, it allows the narrator to share his or her own views, but you have to be careful not to slip into second person when doing that. Now, one of the main disadvantages of third-person omniscient is that it can create confusion when it's not done with the right attention to detail. If narrators don't have a distinct voice, readers can get confused on who is narrating and on which character knows what. So switching to other characters can diffuse the tension or excitement when it's not well planned out as well. Now, it's easy to write as the author instead of the narrator. So that's something common you see in younger writers, that they kind of switch between those two, and you really want to stay consistent as writing from the narrator and not the author. Also, it can be more difficult to forge a connection with the readers if it comes across as too distant or impersonal. Now, advantages of third-person limited or objective, because they're very similar in their advantages and disadvantages. So we'll talk about these two at the same time. So this point of view attempts to combine the best of first and third-person omniscient. The limited and objective point of views allow writers to more deeply explore the narrator and forge a stronger connection with the reader, without asking them to live out the story with the narrator. So the disadvantages of these 2 points of view is that it does limit you to choosing a character as a narrator, and it limits you to the narrator's thoughts and experiences. And this can create some distance, just as most of the third-person point of views can, between the story and the reader. And depending on the type of story, that can be an advantage, but often that serves more as a disadvantage. Some stories may be too raw or personal, and you need some distance to allow the reader to maintain a certain comfort level. But in order to fully understand or experience a story, the reader most often needs to be enveloped in it, and that distance can prevent that connection. Now, the advantages of the third-person deep perspective is that it attempts to remove that distance between narrator and reader by really getting inside the head of the character and really experiencing those moments with the character rather than getting a synopsis of what's happening. The reader can more fully experience what the narrator is thinking and feeling as well. It feels very similar to first person to a reader, but it uses the third person pronouns, which can be important in following certain genre conventions. The main disadvantage of third person deep is that it can be a very challenging point of view to write well, and it's still gaining traction in certain genres. So I kind of just need to be aware of which genres are accepting of this and which aren't. Now, second person point of view is the least most commonly used point of view in modern popular fiction. Second person is written in the present tense and addresses the reader directly using the address of you because the reader is the main character when using second person. This point of view basically makes the reader the protagonist of the story. So the narrator often uses detailed description, shares psychological insights, and tries to anticipate reader reactions. So this can be extremely difficult to do well. This is fairly uncommon in teen and adult fiction, and mainly you'll see that more in younger fiction, but there are some authors recently who have used second person very successfully. And we'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of this. Honestly, the advantages of second person are fairly limited because it's not widely used and it's very difficult to do well. A lot of readers find it very jarring if they pick up a book and it's written in second person because they're not used to it. So it can be really hard for readers to connect to this style of writing. One advantage, though, is that you can create a very different feel to a story, and you can speak directly to the reader and involve them in what's happening in a unique way. But the story really has to be a good fit for this type of narration. Not every story is going to work well with this. So like I said, disadvantages are a bit more prevalent because it's not used very often, and it can feel almost too personal to a reader. Like maybe they don't want to be quite that involved or quite that connected to what's going on in the story. Also, if it's not done well, it tends to have a really juvenile feel to it, which is definitely a problem if you're writing for an adult audience. So a couple things to really think about if you're considering experimenting with second person point of view. Before committing to a whole novel in second person, try writing one or two scenes and then getting feedback from writers and from readers in your target audience. If they're just not feeling it, it just might not be a good fit for that particular story, or maybe you just need to practice that style a little bit more. And if you want to study some examples of really well-written second-person point of view stories, you can check out Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McKierney. Now, let's move on to narrative tense. Narrative tense is what tells the reader when a story is taking place, such as present or simple past tense. This does not necessarily limit verb tense entirely, but it does mean that a large portion of the story relates events in that tense. There are a few things to consider when you're choosing which narrative tense to use. Think about what narrative tense a story is told in, because that's really going to affect how events are related to the reader and how easily a reader can connect with the storytelling. You really want to think through each available tense and maybe even try writing a sample scene in a couple of different tenses to see which one is going to work best. Maybe have a few people even read it for you and give you their thoughts. Now, present tense tells the story as if it were currently happening right in that moment. This can provide a lot of immediacy for the reader. It is, however, less common, and it does require an adjustment period for a lot of readers who aren't used to reading present tense. And some readers just flat out dislike it and will not read stories written in present tense. So you just have to consider that it's just not going to work with a certain percentage of readers. Using present tense can make the right story seem more unique or novel when done well. It creates a level of intensity that can be hard to achieve when using past tense because the reader feels as though they are experiencing or watching events in real time more easily. Believability, however, can be more difficult because the writing has to convince readers that the events really could be happening right then. Now, with simple past tense, this is when the story is told as though it already happened. It's the most common tense, and it's very easily accepted by readers because they're so used to it. Because it's common, there's not really an adjustment period for most readers to acclimate to the style, and it's also pretty much accepted in every genre. It does create more distance between the character and reader because the events have already taken place, and that can be beneficial to the story, or it can detract from it on some occasions. Having that bit of distance can be a really good thing for particularly intense subject matter. Some readers simply do not want to feel like they're right in the story as it's happening with present tense, and so this simple past tense can be a much better option for those readers. There are 3 other narrative tenses, which I'm just going to touch on briefly because they're not super common and they have a lot of similarities to them. So the 3 that I'll touch on are past continuous, past perfect simple, and past perfect continuous, which is a mouthful, I know. These tenses are not used very often to write an entire story or novel, but they might be useful in writing particular scenes, just depending on what the situation is. Past continuous tense describes action in progress, such as they were walking. Past perfect simple describes action that occurred before a character entered the scene, such as they had walked. And past perfect continuous describes action in progress that occurred as the character entered a scene, such as they had been walking. So kind of nitpicky, determining exactly the differences between those 3 tenses. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, mainly focus on present and simple past tense. So let's move on to elements of narrative voice. There are 3 elements that can really impact the way a story is told. And the first one that I want to discuss is attitude. Attitude mainly has to do with emotion, values, beliefs, worldview, and feelings about a particular person or situation. The attitude of the narrative voice reveals how the narrator speaks, the narrator's body language, his or her reactions, and the actions taken in a specific situation. Attitude adds uniqueness to the character's voice and provides deeper characterization. Consider the phrase, "I can't believe you 2 met online." This could change depending on who says it and how it's said. A friend of the couple who is of a similar age and understands the various facets of online dating might say it with pleasant surprise, happy that their story worked out. But an older relative who distrusts the internet might say it with derision and eye the boyfriend or girlfriend skeptically. In both cases, the reader is given further insight into the speaker. Now, the next one is tone. Tone isn't just what is said, but how something is said. And it can completely change the meaning of the actual words. Think about the phrase, "I'm sure you could." It can be supportive and kind when said in a soft and loving tone, or snarky and dismissive if the "sure" is emphasized in a spiteful tone, followed up by an eye roll or a huff of annoyance. Speed of speech, loudness or quietness, word choice, emotion behind the words, and physical actions accompanying the words all affect the tone. So keep in mind that not all body language and connotations are universal, so make sure that what you're trying to convey with the tone is understood by most readers. And lastly, let's consider personal style. And this is the personal style of the narrator, not the writer. This includes vocabulary, sentence structure, grammar and technical aspects, cadence, and personal preferences. This can be developed for each character to highlight uniqueness. Be careful not to overdo it with too much slang or jargon or colloquialisms that reading the narrator's dialogue or thoughts becomes a chore for the reader. Give it just enough that the voice is recognizable to the reader when you switch narrators. So now let's talk about narrative modes. Narrative modes are the individual elements used to relay a story to the reader, and they include dialogue, action, exposition, thought, and scene. And a lot of you may be familiar with these, but I'm just going to run through them quickly, just to kind of give an overview and a reminder of what each of these elements is and what it's used to accomplish. So dialogue is the talk that's exchanged between characters. It is spoken communication and is punctuated with quotations. It can be used to impart information to the reader and also to show a character's personality and unique qualities, as well as to progress the story. Action is the events portrayed as they happen in a story. Action takes time to develop and happens in a specific place at a specific time. Action is not a report of something that happened, a summary, basically. It should be described blow by blow. Action should have meaning and purpose, and it should serve to progress the story in some way. Description gives details about how something or a place, a person looks, behaves, or functions. It should always have specific purpose and not be just superfluous filler. It should develop setting, characters, situation, and time period. Description should also not be self-serving or irrelevant to the situation or story. It should help orient readers in the scene, and you should only give the reader enough description to make sure they can accurately picture the image you want them to picture. Leave the rest to the reader's imagination, and they'll fill in the pieces. Exposition is the telling of the story through the act of relaying information. It's used to explain, transition between scenes, and offer narrative summary in order to skip certain details that are unimportant but necessary, such as average day-to-day activities like hygiene or traveling to and from locations. Too much exposition or exposition instead of showing how a character experiences an event is referred to as telling. Not every part of the story should be told as exposition. Next up is thought. Thought or internal dialogue is character self-talk or the inner thoughts of the character. It may be only thoughts or actual talk, like self-encouragement or disparagement, that the character tells him or herself. In third-person narration, thought is italicized to mark it as different from dialogue. First-person wording I is also used in thoughts. In first-person narration, thought is woven into the exposition and narration, rather than being completely separated. Now with scene sets the stage for a particular part of a story or an event. It informs the reader of the situation the story section will take place in and offers pertinent details that help develop or provide context for the events taking place. Special attention should be paid to the opening and closing of each scene so it does not begin or extend beyond what's relevant. Now, all of that is a lot of information to consider when you're choosing your storytelling modes and aspects and how you're going to do it. So when you're thinking about all of these and which one's going to work best for your story, you really want to remember that every story has a unique balance of narrative modes based on which ones create the most appropriate feel. Modes should be varied. Stories that rely too heavily on one, or maybe just one or two, can really start to feel monotonous over the length of the story. You want to vary modes to open and close scenes, break up big chunks of dialogue with action, avoid long sections of thought, space out action scenes to give readers a chance to reflect and anticipate what comes next. And then keep description to what's relevant and what helps develop the story, setting, or characters. So as you're approaching and planning out a new story project and you're really considering how you're going to tell the story, it can often be beneficial to pick and choose a few different points of view or narrative modes or tenses and write a few key scenes using different modes and tenses and perspectives. And then if you can, have a couple of different people read them and get their thoughts on which one helps them connect the most with the story, with the characters, and which just feels right. A lot of time, the more practiced a writer is, the more they can start instinctively choosing some of these. But especially if you're a newer writer, or if you're switching genres, or just trying out a new style or perspective, it can be really helpful to kind of go back to these basic elements and just really think through what each one does, how it impacts the story, and how it's going to help you better tell a story from a particular standpoint or perspective. Hopefully this was a helpful review if you're an established writer, or if you're a newer writer, to really help you dig a little bit more into your storytelling methods. If you have any further questions, you can always find me on my website or my blog. And if you have any other ideas for future podcast episodes, reach out to me. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. Thanks for taking the time to listen to the podcast this week. I'll be back next time with new craft articles and helpful tips. Thanks again for listening to Author Life Podcast. For more information on the podcast or guest authors, check out the links in the show description. If there's a topic you'd like to learn more about, find me online and send me suggestions anytime.